Roll away your stone, I'll roll away mine. Together we can see what we will find.
Welcome to this week's edition of our sermon follow-up video. This was Easter weekend that we just finished, and it was a great weekend, great season, I think. Leading up to that, we had some great things going on. And our sermon series had ended the week before that, and Pastor Brian preached on Easter, and it was sort of what we call a one-hit wonder, which is kind of normal for Easter. But the sermon was just titled Void, and it was a great morning. It was a great time we had, and the idea was that I'm going to read it so I make sure that I do it the way that Brian did it, because it was really well put. The theme, kind of what he went with, is the void in our heart can be filled by the one who left the void in the tomb. And that's pretty catchy. That's pretty cool. That's very tweetable. So that was sort of the overall theme and what we were going with. And it was great. And so a couple of follow-up questions to go along with that theme of that void and how we can break that down. You mentioned that all of us were born with this void in our heart, apart from God. Without that, we have this gap there. Can you explain to us why that is, and then we'll move into what to do about it and how to see that. But why are we designed that way?
Yeah, well, the big thing I think, and it goes back to something I said, was we are created for relationship. Everything is based on relationship, and we quickly looked at, you have the Trinity, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, which is a relationship. And then you look at creation, 6 days of creation, how everything was done. It was done in relationship to what happened the day before or days before. Then you had the relationship of man being created in creation and how man was supposed to relate to creation. And then, as I said, God said there's not a helper suitable amongst all creation, which is kind of, when you think about it, he's up there like, wonder I can join to Adam. Nothing. So it creates a woman, and which we're very thankful for. And so now we have the marriage relationship where man and woman are to be joined together, and as it says in Genesis 2. And then ultimately, Adam and Eve had a relationship with God that just blows my mind. The fact that they were told one thing, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they did. And as a result of that, they were ashamed, they were naked, they hid. And it tells us that God walked into the garden, which sometimes I try to put myself in their shoes and think, man, what would that be like?
Oh, yeah, what would that look like?
Like, Marco, Polo, it's God walking into the garden saying, where are you? And, it was just amazing to think the relationship they had. Well, sin changed all that. And so we're told that God wanted to have relationship again with man. He wanted to be reconciled. That's the word reconciliation. And we find it in Romans. We find it in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And so it's a very common word, and that word means to change or alter. In other words, how do you get from where you're at to where you need to be? And there has to be something that takes place. And so God said, I wanted to have that relationship with man again. And the way he did that was through another relationship. And so because of that sin that happened, we as humans have been left with this yearning, this emptiness, whatever you want to call it, this void. And we know something belongs there, but we don't quite understand what it is. And so we look at everything we can in order to fill that void.
Yeah.
So the reason we have that void ultimately is because of the fall of man and sin. And so now we're left with this reconciliation because Christ came down to die for us, that it needs to be filled.
Yeah, absolutely. We're designed to have that relationship. And even before we know it's broken and we're missing it, that void is still very prevalent in our lives. And it can become a nagging, that we search for and find all these wrong things to plug into. So that's the next question. How do we know? I remember before I was a believer, I didn't know I was blind, right? Like I wasn't going around, I'm missing something. Someone tell me what, I didn't get that. But then afterwards, after I came to Christ, it became clear, oh man, I'd been living life in black and white and didn't even realize it. How can it, and Christians are just as susceptible to this really as non-Christians. What are some signs that we can see or notice in our own lives where we can say, I'm filling that void with the wrong thing?
Yeah, something you said that was key there. And my perspective is a little bit different. The fact that I did become a Christian at a young age, but it never really took root. So it's kind of like, okay, I accepted Christ and let me do life. And so I still try to fill it with things of the world, if you want to say it that way. because that's kind of how we usually talk in our Christianese of things of the world versus things of God. But it's interesting, like you said, we don't realize when we're doing it why we're doing it. And you look back over your life and you think, okay, why is it that I have this yearning, this emptiness, there's just something missing. And so for a lot of people, it becomes money. You know, the goal in life, the American dream is to go to school, to do well, to graduate, get into a good school, study, get out, make a lot of money. Work for 40 years of your life, make as much money as you can, retire, and then pick up seashells with your Argyle socks and your flip sunshades on the coast of Florida. That is the American dream.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah. So, you know, and to people, they think that brings meaning, but yet you find that people, the more money they make, the emptier they are. And so if I make more money, I can buy a bigger house. I buy a bigger house. Well, I fill this house, but I haven't filled my life. You know, if I buy a better car, and yet, no, that doesn't do it for me. And, you know, even in marriage, you know, look at our society as a whole, our culture, even the world in general. I have this wife or this husband, yay, I'm married to them, and then all of a sudden it loses its luster, and you're like, all right, well, they don't fill that void anymore, so I'll just leave them by the wayside. I'll go get someone else to fill that void. And there's many other things. Some people turn to substance abuse. It could be a multitude of things. Some people bury themselves online in imaginary worlds because they're trying to fill this emptiness that is in there. And as you said, Christians are just as susceptible. You know, we think, well, if I go to church, if I'm in more ministries, if I go to more home groups, you know, if I do more of this, if I read my Bible 23 hours a day, that's going to fill the void. And it's not. That's religion if you start looking at it that way. And religion's never going to fill the void.
That's
no
an
matter what you
important
do.
distinction to make.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, yeah.
So, and that's why, because you go back to what we started with, everything's based on relationship. Religion's not a relationship. Religion is what you do. And it's interesting because people in the world will say, well, I'm not a religious person. And you turn around and you look at them and you say, well, I'm not either. And they think, well, what do you mean you're not religious? Well, religion will never satisfy my life. I will always have to do more. So religion in itself leaves you emptier, if you can be emptier, I guess, than before, because you'll never do enough. Every false religion of this world is built on the premise that I have to do more. And you never will. You'll never do enough. And that's what makes Christianity so unique. It's built on a relationship, not on what you do. So,
Yeah, no, that's good. So then that leads to the last question. You know, we can sort of notice some of the signs that we are filling our life with the wrong things. You know, when you look around, you have everything, but you're still dissatisfied. Right, that's a sign, right? Mm-hmm. You find yourself, you know, you're surrounded by loved ones, but you still feel lonely. That's a sign of something's missing, you know, that can't be filled by those things. So,
Yeah.
So with that being true, then how do we fill the void with the right thing, you know?
yeah, well, to bridge on what you just said, you know, it's interesting. We have all the people around us, yet we're empty. We have all the money around us, yet it doesn't satisfy. We've changed jobs multiple times, yet have not found that satisfaction. And the way we know it is when you accept Christ. And man, the only way I can explain it is when I fully gave my life to Christ at the age of 17, not, you know, I believe I did accept Christ at a young age, but when I really said, okay, all of this, as bad as it looks, is yours. Do with it what you will. There was this overwhelming sense of something changed in my life. And now my life was not meant to be lived for myself. It was meant to be lived for Christ. I submitted, it says in Galatians, I crucified the evil desires of the flesh so I could live in Christ. And the reason for that is because God gave us Jesus Christ, the ultimate relationship. And when you have that relationship with Jesus Christ, when you are growing, as we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, when you're growing in that relationship, when you're constantly filling that relationship, man, it leaves you so satisfied. So I'm married to my wife, and I'm satisfied with my wife because my wife doesn't fill the void in my life. My wife is a direct result of Christ being in my life. And so I don't look at my wife to fill something in my life. My wife is a relationship because of Christ. You know, my ministry, what I do, does not fill a void in my life. It does not bring value to my life because I'm a pastor. No, being a Christian, being someone who has a relationship with Christ, that is what brings it. And so money doesn't matter, and people will look at you and say, yeah, don't you want to make more money? Not really, because I see people who make lots of money and they're miserable. And yet there's been times where I've had no money and been as satisfied as could be because I have Christ. And, you know, when you think about what he says, Are you willing to give up everything in order to follow me? And of course, we're like, yeah, I would. But when you think about it, and this is tough, but what if everything was stripped from me tomorrow? And you look at Job, everything was taken, everyone turned their back on Job. The only thing he was left with was his life, and it was a shattered life, if that. And yet he would not turn his back on God. He wouldn't do it, no matter how many people were like, Job, you should do this. He's like, no, I'm not going to. And I have to think of my own life that if tragically my family was taken, if all of a sudden, this church didn't exist, I still have everything because I have Christ. Ultimately that void is filled. And, the best way I can explain it is, and I don't think words do it justice, what it's like to have a relationship with Christ. If that's something you don't have, man, that I would pray. And like I said on Sunday, I can't imagine going through life without Christ now. But when you have him in your life, you don't look for things outside. I mean, there might be times where people do, but you're still going to come back and say, man, that's not doing it, because Christ is the only thing that's going to fill that void. The only thing. And so I don't look for a bigger paycheck. I don't look for a new wife. I don't look for different kids. I don't look for a new car, because those things don't matter to me. They're just, my family does matter, but they're byproducts of my relationship with Christ. Because without Christ, I would have none of that. It's all because of submitting my life to him. And the interesting thing is, it's not about just believing that he died. The important thing is, he rose again. That sets apart that he has power over everything, meaning he has power over all this stuff that's in this world. He far surpasses it in value because of what he did. And so I'm very thankful to have that relationship. And man, that is what it's all about, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians that we looked at. Man, without this, it would be worthless. It would be a folly. It would be a joke. But we know, because Jesus Christ rose and wants a relationship with us, man, we have everything. We have the most valuable thing in the world. We have the authorities, it says in Matthew 20, all authority under heaven and earth. Yeah. What else could you want?
Yeah. No, that's good. That's true. And, you're right. You see all this other stuff, your family and the money and all those things. Those things in and of themselves are not bad, of course.
Right.
But it's when we put them in the wrong priority. It makes me think of Matthew 6:33, I think it is. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. What fills that void is that relationship with Christ. And it's so true. I mean, how many people do you see who have it all, right? The famous people, they've got all the money, they got all the fame, everybody loves them, and they're at the end, there's nothing left for them to get. And so what do? They're in rehab every other day. They're just like, their life just falls apart. And not saying that people who are Christians don't have struggles,
right?
Not at all. But Job's a good example. We turn back to that, and you focus. His relationship with the Lord is what sustains us, and the rest of it is gravy, really, almost. And, no, so that's good. That's very, very good. And I'm glad you brought up the resurrection, and you said it's not just that he died, but it's that he rose. There are countless people who claim to be God. All of them have died, and none of them came back except for one, and that's the one who actually was God. And that's what and you brought that down on Easter, and where Paul says about, hey, if this isn't true, then we're most to be pitied. And it's true, and all this can be the case because we have a living God, and the tomb is empty. There's a void there, so there doesn't have to be a void in us. And I thought that was a great way to put it. It was a good message and a good Sunday. This does lead in pretty well to our next series. Right. We're getting ready to start a new series called Running on Empty. We're going to look at 6 specific spiritual disciplines and kind of practical ways to abide in Christ and to fill our tank, so to speak. And it goes right along with what Brian was saying just now. So we hope you'll join us for that. I think it'll be a great series. Thanks for joining us.
It's not the long walk home that will change this heart, but the welcome I receive with the restart.